I vividly remember the first time I ever came across the phrase all in. My name's Stephen, by the way. I'm one of the pastors on our team here, and we're in this series called All In. And I was trying to think about when was the first time I became aware that this phrase was a thing. You know, it's kind of permeated all through our pop culture now. It's in sports, it's in politics, it's kind of everywhere we look. But the first time for me that I became aware of this phrase and kind of clued into what it meant was probably about 20 years ago during the World Series of Poker Texas Hold'em craze. Does anybody remember this season of our life? Yeah, a few of you. If you don't know or if you don't remember this time of our lives, ESPN kind of overnight started showing the World Series of Poker almost every day on TV, and it just kind of caught on like wildfire. And there was this specific game that they would play called Texas Hold'em. And there was a moment in Texas Hold'em, I didn't understand kind of all the rules. I still don't fully understand kind of how you play Texas Hold'em. In fact, the closest I ever got to this was, I told you before that music was a big part of my life. I played all around town when I was in college at Georgia. And I actually had a gig one night in the upstairs of the old Wild Wing Cafe on Washington Street. Does anybody remember this place? Yes, may it rest in peace for sure. But I remember showing up to play this gig and I realized, I'm not just playing for whoever's hanging out at the restaurant tonight. There was a Texas Hold'em poker tournament happening upstairs and I was the music for that. And if it sounds sad, because it is, I think I got paid in wings, which that wasn't sad, that was exciting. But that's the closest I ever got to it. So I didn't really understand the rules, but I did understand this moment when you were playing Texas Hold'em, when you were kind of in this World Series of Poker deal, where somebody would push all of their chips to the middle of the table and they would say what? All in, thank you. And that's the first time I ever kind of became aware of this phrase. And that phrase specifically began to catch on, and really people point to that moment in our history as the launching point of this becoming a very common word or phrase in our culture. And when somebody would go all in when they were playing poker, it was this climactic scene. And you know that poker players are trained to never show emotion, but when somebody would go all in, people would start sweating. Stuff would start go down. People would get up and start walking around the room. The announcers on TV would get really excited. And when someone goes all in, the reason why that's exciting and kind of a climactic scene is because there's no turning back. And all in has come to describe a moment for you, for me, for anybody, whenever somebody fully commits themselves to something, they go all in. And if you missed last week, we are in this series called All In, where we're taking that same concept and we're asking the question, what would it look like for all of us to go all in with our relationship with God? Specifically, what would it look like for you and me to be fully surrendered to Jesus? What would that mean? If you're here today and maybe you're not a Jesus person and church really isn't part of your normal rhythm and you see that on the screen and you're like, hey, I don't know if I'm there yet. I'm just kind of checking it out. I'm not really sure. That's kind of a big leap for me. And maybe regardless of your faith background, maybe you're thinking that right now. But I would argue this. I would say this is a perfect time for you to be here because no matter what our faith background is, I think all of us have gone all in on something in our life. All of us have experienced what it's like to commit everything we have to someone or something. Maybe it was a job opportunity for you once upon a time. Maybe it was a relationship. Could have been moving to a new town. College students, it could have been choosing where you wanted to go to school or choosing your major or maybe for your graduate program, whatever it is. We know what it's like to push everything to the center of the table, and the vulnerability of trusting what's on the other side of that table is really something. It can be a moment that really stays with you the rest of your life. And so all of us know what it's like to go all in on something. But I would say for many of us, when it comes to our relationship with God, maybe we've pushed a lot of those chips to the middle of the table. But for many people, what prevents them and what prevents us from going all in is we're kind of holding on to something underneath the table, and that's the area of our money. And this is just so common. This is not a series meant to shame you or guilt you. This is just the human experience. There's something about money that we just refuse to put it in the middle of the table and push it with everything else that we have to the center and go all in. There's something in you and there's something in me that wants to hold on to it. Now, this isn't something that we came up with. This is something that Jesus taught thousands of years ago. I don't know about you, but it's comforting to me to know that we're not the first generation to struggle with this tension, to want to hold on to our finances. In fact, in arguably the most famous sermon that Jesus ever taught, in Matthew chapter 6, he says this. He says, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." It's the words of Jesus. Now, what's Jesus getting at there? Well, clearly in the Sermon on the Mount, his most famous sermon of all time, he's trying to get across to you and me and to his audience of the day. It's really difficult to go through life with a divided heart. If some of you is committed over here and some of you is committed over here, that's going to be really difficult and you're going to end up being exhausted. And the example that Jesus uses to get his point across is money. Now, we got to ask the question, why would he choose that specific thing to get this point across? And the reason is because as you study the life, the teaching of Jesus, as you go through this series, I think what you're going to learn and what we're all going to see together is that Jesus knew something about your heart and my heart that's so brilliant. Jesus knew something about your heart and my heart that's still true today, thousands of years later. What Jesus knew about you and me is that the number one competitor, the number one thing that is going to vie for the attention and the dedication of your heart more than anything in this world or in your relationship with God is your money. It's finances. So much so, Jesus would say, hey, when you put your trust in money, when you dedicate all of your heart to money, don't be surprised when it starts to control you. And many of us know what this feels like. Every decision we make is based on money. Everything that comes into our path is based on money. We can't get away from basing so much of our life on our finances. And Jesus says, look, when you go all in and trust in money, don't be surprised when it controls you. In the same way, when you go all in and trust in God, God then takes over control of your life. And I think all of us would say, well, Stephen, I want to have money, but I don't want it to control me. Very few of us would actually want that for our life. But we feel the daily pull. We feel the daily tug. We feel the tension, the struggle of, I need more, I want more. In order for me to feel safe, in order for me to feel secure, the number in my bank account has got to hit this in order for me to feel those things, to have security, happiness, freedom, peace, whatever it is. And today, I want to talk about one specific thing that I think maybe is why so many of us have a closed fist with our money, and we maybe never have surrendered that and control of that over to God. And to get there, we got to go through something, and it's the issue of trust. It's an issue of trust for many of us. Now, when we talk about trust, we got to all be on the same page about what I'm talking about. So I'm defining trust this way. Trust is to believe in the reliability of someone or something. Trust is when you and I see someone, we see something in life, and we go, I actually am so convinced of the reliability of that thing, of that person, that I'm going to give my trust to it. Which begs an interesting thought. Trust is something you can actually give away. It's a possession that you have. You can give it to someone. You can give it to something. And no matter if you're a Jesus person or not, we do this all the time. Even with all of our trust issues, we trust others and we trust things all the time. Some of us, we trust in our favorite sports team so much that you actually put money on it every week. That's how much you trust it. We trust in getaways. We trust in vacations. We trust in experiences. Why? Because we believe those things are so reliable, they're going to give us what we want. And even when it comes to the arena of our faith, many of us are not opposed to trusting God. In fact, if you're a Jesus follower here this morning, and I kind of went through the series of your life, the different events of your life, and I asked you, I said, hey, has there ever been a time where you had to trust God with a big decision, I think you would probably say, yeah, I needed to trust God's wisdom. And then sometimes I might come to you and say, if you're a parent like me, have you ever gotten to a point where you realized that parenting was too big for you and you weren't really sure how to do it and you needed guidance? I think we trust God for guidance all the time. And then not only that, if you're a Christian here today, what you're saying is that you are trusting in Jesus as the Son of God, who came to this earth to live a sinless life, to die a death for our sin that we deserve, who raised from the dead to defeat death and sin once and for all, so that you and I can be reconnected to God and spend eternity with him. That means that you've trusted God with your eternal destination. And so this morning, I'm simply asking the question, why trust God with those things, but not trust him with your money? It's a really fascinating question, but it's one that I think actually has a very good reason. And so if you've not taken this step ever, maybe this is something that you're not really clued into, it's a new idea for you, or you've never taken the step to surrender control of your finances to God, I don't fault you for that. Because I think there's something behind trust that is more powerful than maybe we're willing to admit. And that's the concept of fear. And today, I'm not just talking about fear in a general sense and in a broad sense. Today, I want to be really specific. And today, I want to talk about financial fear. Do you have any financial fear in your life right now? Let me just do us all a favor and say the quiet part out loud. We all have financial fear. Either right now or at some point in your life, there was a worry. There is a, how's this going to work out? There is, am I ever going to have enough? There is a fear, there's a worry, there's an anxiety around finances that all of us know what that feels like. And there's a lot of reasons why we get there. For many of you in the financial area of your life, you've dealt with broken promises before. You've dealt with pain before. You've dealt with unmet expectations. And whenever this is true of you and me, especially in the financial arena of our life, it does something to our ability to trust. In fact, I actually believe that trust or fear doesn't cause you to lose trust. I don't think fear takes your trust away. That'd be kind of a logical thing if we thought about it. I think fear makes you and me put our trust in something else. And we have an enemy in this life. We have a spiritual enemy that we believe his name is Satan, and his native tongue is to lie. Jesus said that about him. He said his native tongue, whenever he opens his mouth, all he can do is just tell a lie. And Satan knows this about you and me. He knows that there's a fear there. There's a financial fear there. There's broken promises. There's unmet expectations. There's pain. And so I think our enemy would take that fear and wants us to trust in something else. And the lie that he is saying so loudly right now in our culture is this. He's saying, listen, the answer to your fears is money. Hey, I know you're afraid. And I know that you're looking for something reliable to base your life on. So that's no problem. If you're afraid, if you've got financial fear, then your answer is just more money. And when we agree with that lie, we put our trust in money. I've been there. Many of you have been there. Do you have a fear in life right now you believe, you think money will solve? If you do, then what do we do with that? Is there a possibility of getting over that or through that, and maybe, just maybe, our trust moving from our money to God? Well, thankfully, there's an individual in the scriptures who dealt with this same tension. I love the word of God because there's so many examples of real people who lived a real life, who went through real issues. And we're going to look at an individual today in two different books of the Old Testament. If you have your all-in booklet or you have your Bible, you want to turn to page 16 in your booklet, Ecclesiastes. In your Bible, we're going to be in Ecclesiastes and in Proverbs, two different passages. But on page 16, they're both listed there for you, as well as a place to take notes. But today we're going to talk about an individual named King Solomon. King Solomon is a very famous person from the Bible. He's found throughout a lot of the Old Testament. Just to give you a sense of who he was and kind of help you get the picture as you turn there. King Solomon was the king of Israel, son of David. He had a massive amount of wealth. He had a massive amount of influence. He had a massive amount of power. And if you've never read the book of Ecclesiastes, it's written by Solomon. And it's absolutely fascinating. In fact, in our Bible reading plan, if you're clued into that for our church, there's going to be some passages in Ecclesiastes this week. If you've never read it, I highly encourage you to, because Solomon, what he does is one day, he looks around and he goes, hey, I have all this power, this influence, this wealth. I actually am in a position, I can probably figure out how life works best. And the book of Ecclesiastes is all about his quest to try to figure out how life works. And in chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, he goes, hey, I've got a lot of knowledge. I have a lot of wisdom. I have access to information. Maybe that's how life works. So he kind of goes all in on knowledge and gaining as much information and answers to life problems as he can. And he documents what that's like. And he goes, no, I don't think that's it. And then he looks around and he goes, hang on, I've got a massive amount of wealth. In fact, in chapter 2, right before the passage we're going to read, he says, I became greater in this area than anybody ever had been in Jerusalem before me. And so Solomon goes, maybe money, maybe seeing my finances, maybe seeing wealth as the most reliable thing about life, maybe that's the best way that life is going to work. And so I'm going to go and pursue that and go all in on that. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 10, this is the result. Solomon says this, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done, and when I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Solomon says, look, when I trusted in the financial area of my life, when I decided that was the most reliable thing about life, here's the result. He uses this phrase. He says it was a chasing after the wind. But the same guy, Solomon, wrote this very well-known passage in Proverbs chapter 3. He says this. He says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. And lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. So we have two approaches to life. One in which money is the most trustworthy thing. And Solomon says it's kind of like this chasing after the wind. And then the other was that God was the most trustworthy thing. And Solomon said the result of that was it felt like the path of my life was straight. So what does God maybe want to teach us about that through Solomon? I think it's this, is that when we trust in money, we go in circles. But when we trust in God, he makes our path straight. What do I mean by that? I mean my kids, they love to play this game where they just keep a balloon up in the air as long as possible. What are they doing? They're literally, the game could be called chasing after the wind. That's what they're doing. And what Solomon said is when I went all in and trusted in money, that's what my life was like. But when I trusted in God, the path of my life became straight. What does he mean by all that? Well, in Ecclesiastes 2, he says, when I went all in on money, here's what my life was like. There was toil, everything was meaningless, and it was a chasing after the wind. Toil, everything was meaningless, and a chasing after the wind. What does he mean by that? When money is the sole focus of your heart, you have to work to have enough, and there's never enough. So you work. And then when you reach that level, money becomes so important to you that all you're doing is trying to achieve more, and you look around one day and go, I don't know if my life has much purpose. All I'm doing is trying to get enough, and there's never enough. And at that point, Solomon said, money had become so ingrained in my heart that it was the thing I was trusting in. It kind of became the compass for my life. And so it became a chasing after the wind. Wherever the money went, that's where I had to go. Many of us know what that's like. But you compare that to what he says in Proverbs chapter 3. He says, but when I trusted in the Lord with everything, when I trusted with all my heart in God, he made my path straight. Now, what does that mean? How could that be possible? I think there's two things about God that Solomon's getting at here. Number one is, God can make your path straight when you trust in him with all you have because he never changes. Think about it. The God that we serve, Scripture tells us that he's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. When you are on a journey somewhere and you're by yourself, it's very easy to get off course and to take detours. But when someone's leading you, no matter where they go, you're following straight after them. And Solomon says, I realize that God never changes. He makes my path straight because of that. But you know what does change? Money, finances, the number in your bank account, the economy, markets, all of those things change. But God never changes. Another way that God can make our paths straight as we trust in him with all that we have when we go all in is this. We discover that he's bigger than the problems in our path. Many of us today would look at our life and go, yeah, I've got some problems in front of me, so much that I can't see anything other than that problem. And for many, the greatest problem you have today is probably financial. In fact, maybe the biggest problem in your path is some form of financial fear. And if that's you and you say, hey, I honestly can't think of anything else. It is so all-encompassing, that's all I can see. Solomon would tell you, hey, the God that we serve, the God that I know, the God that I trusted all of my heart with, eventually I realized he was bigger than the problems in my path, and he could lead me through that very problem that was preventing me from getting to where he wanted me to go. Have you thought about how big God is lately? For so many of us, we view God as a God that we can put in our pocket, a God that we can put in the glove compartment or our backpack when we're going around campus, but that's not the God of the Scriptures. Listen to this language here from the Word of God about the bigness of God. This is from Colossians chapter 1. Paul's describing Jesus. He says, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. That's the God who's bigger than your financial fear. In Isaiah, we see this. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. Then I love this from David in Psalm 8. David says, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. The God who is before all things, the God in whom all things were created, in whom all things hold together, who set the moon and the stars in place, who knows the number of hairs on your head and sand on the beach. That God is bigger than your bank account. That's the God who's asking you to trust him, even in the face of financial fear, because he's bigger than that. And now we're bumping up against something that's just another one of those tensions that we have to wrestle to the ground when it comes to trust and the fear that we have in our finances. And that is that your ability to trust in God greatly depends on your view of God. Your ability to trust in God with everything you have, especially the area of your finances, it's going to depend greatly on how you view God. And if you view God as a taker and not a provider, if you view God as bigger than your fear instead of him being bigger than your fear, if you view God as someone who doesn't care about your bank account, if you view God as somebody who's not interested in the details of your financial life, it's going to be very difficult for you to trust him financially. A.W. Tozer is a theologian and author who's passed away many years ago, but wrote a book that's been really instrumental in my life called Knowledge of the Holy. And in his book, he has this quote that's been so incredible. He says this: "What comes to our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us." What comes to your mind, what comes to my mind, when God enters our mind, what comes to mind is the most important thing about us. And so I just have to ask you this morning, what comes to mind when you think about God? What's your answer to that question? Because how you answer that question is actually going to impact your ability to trust him financially more than we're probably willing to admit. What comes to mind when you think about God? And if you don't have a view of God that's bigger than your bank account, it's going to be really hard to trust him financially. But the God of the universe is inviting you to trust him today, even in the middle of all your financial fear, even in the middle of all your trust issues. He is worthy of your trust. You know why? Because he's bigger than our fear. He's inviting you to trust him financially, to go all in with everything that you have, because he is bigger than your fear. And remember, as we go all in, to trust him fully means to trust him financially. To trust him fully means to trust him financially. Now you hear all that and you say, Stephen, that's great. It's really helpful to remember how big God is. He can't fit in my pocket. He's big. He's the creator of the universe. He put the moon and stars in place. That's awesome. But I'm still afraid. You don't know my story. You don't know how I've been hurt, all the unmet expectations, all the pain, all the broken promises. And I would just say, I understand. I understand the human experience. I understand what it's like to have fear financially. But I also understand when you take a step and move towards him through generosity, in the face of your fear, he proves not only to be bigger than your fear, but he proves to provide for every single thing that you need. And the thing that so many of us are trying to find through trusting in money is peace and freedom and security. And Solomon would say, hey, I did that. I tried that. And all money led me to do was chase after the wind. But I actually found that when I went all in and trusted in the Lord with all my heart. But don't just take my word for it. I want you to listen to the story of my friend Shane and his journey of going all in and how God met him even in the middle of financial fear. So if you would, turn your attention to the screens and take a look at this.
My name is Shane Burke. I've been going to Athens Church for about 5 years, 26, and I sell software for a big tech company. So I decided to trust God with my finances and go all in November of 2020. I was a recent college graduate and had just started making real money for the first time. And I realized that I had been surrendered to God in other areas of my life, but I hadn't yet given him my finances. And after conversations with a couple really important people in my life, I realized that that was something I needed to do. But at the beginning, it was really only out of a guilty conscience that I felt. I knew that there wasn't really any reason that I shouldn't be giving. And shortly after, God really started to work in my heart and create a generous heart in me. Before going all in with my finances, I really was hesitant around, honestly, just selfish ambitions. I was scared that I may need the money in other areas, or what bill could I be paying with this money, or what could I be buying for myself or adding on to the house, whatever the case may be. I just had a lot of selfish ambition, and my own desires were more important than the command to give 10% to the church. Now that I've trusted God financially, I've seen God be really faithful in my life in a couple of different areas. One is just the general idea that when I gave God my finances and was obedient in that area, I saw him be faithful to me. And now I can trust him in other areas of my life where he's calling me to be obedient. I know that I can trust his faithfulness because of what he's shown me through this area of my life. Additionally, it was here at Athens Church that I started a relationship with Jesus. And I know that a lot of people before me gave generously to this church and funded the mission and helped me grow in a relationship with Jesus. And now I get to do that for others. If anyone hasn't trusted God financially, I would say it's a worthy sacrifice. He is worthy of our obedience. He calls us to it, and he is faithful to deliver on his promise.
When we talk about all in, what we're getting at this Sunday and the rest of the series is we're talking about all your heart. And Jesus, thousands of years ago, just laid it out really plainly. He said, look, there's no way to go through life with a divided heart. You're either going to be all in and surrendering to God, or eventually money is going to take over the control of your life, because that's where your attention and your focus and the reliability of your life is going to be. And this Sunday and throughout the rest of this series, we're asking you to just consider taking a step of generosity. And this week, I specifically have three things I want you to wrestle with and kind of three action items. One is I want you to think about this question. What comes to mind when I think about God? If you've never thought of that question before, it's greatly going to impact your ability to trust God. What comes to mind when I think about God? And then secondly, this question, how does that view of God impact my ability to trust him financially? If I can actually articulate what comes to mind when I think about him, how does that impact my ability to trust him financially? And then lastly, many of you got a card like this on the way out last week, but if you don't have one, they're in the seat in front of you. We want everyone to take one today if you don't have one already. And this is a card that we've just tried to make it really simple for you on looking at maybe where you are in your steps of generosity and obedience and going all in with your finances and surrendering control of that over to God. And then what step might God want you to take? And so the step this week is to put this on your fridge, to put it on your dashboard, to put it somewhere you see it, and just start asking God, what is causing me from not being all in? What financial fear do I have? What lack of trust am I struggling with that's preventing me from taking what I have in my hand under the table and throwing it into the middle of the table with everything else in my life? Pushing it to the center and saying, Lord, I'm all in. I'm trusting you with every area of my heart. Imagine if you did that. Not just if you thought about it today, but if you actually did it. In a few weeks, we're going to ask everybody to turn those in. Imagine if you did that. Imagine surrendering control of the thing that's controlling you. What might God do with that? Well, I think through Shane's story and through what we talked about this morning, I think we'll discover that he is faithful to respond maybe with more peace than you thought possible, more freedom than you thought possible, more provision maybe than you thought possible. Because when we see money as the most reliable thing about life, Solomon was really clear. Hey, life is going to feel like it's going in circles. But when all of our heart is entrusted to the God of the universe, he makes our path straight because he never changes. And he's worthy of that trust because he's bigger than the biggest financial fear you're carrying right now. So what I want to do right now is pray for you. Father, thank you so much for leading us to this place where we can understand that you are worthy to be trusted because you're bigger than our fear. But to trust you fully means to also trust you financially. I pray for anybody here who is dealing with a financial fear so big they have not even been able to see you on the other side of it. And I pray that today they would recognize that you are bigger than they ever thought you were. That you are leading them and want to lead them on a straight path towards your heart that's full of peace, that's full of freedom. Because, Lord, you've been generous to us. And I pray that we would all consider and pray into and follow you in generosity back to you and surrendering our heart, even our financial life, In your name I pray. Amen.